O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
Anyway, what's up, Mr. Church of the Eternal Logos? How you doing, my friend?
What's going on, Jay? How you doing, brother?
Doing great, and so glad to have you. Sorry about I'm the worst person when it comes to scheduling stuff. I'm just terrible. I'm sorry.
It's all good, man. I didn't know what time you mentioned. Again, we had the schedule for like right before you went down to Atlanta last week. So we were talking about sort of 7-ish o'clock, and then I saw it was like 7:05 when you redated the
Yeah, I'm
stream. So
sorry.
I just assumed it was 7:05.
I don't know what I was thinking. I meant it to be later on, but
I know
here we are.
I was talking to Jethro, and we thought you were probably thinking Central Standard Time,
Yeah, I
and so
can't.
we were thinking you
I
were
don't know
probably
what
an
any of
hour
this
off.
stuff is. People are like, "What time zone are you in?" And I'm like, "The one where the hands go around the clock." That normal time where time, minute by minute, by minute, by minute, by minute. Anyway, so our boy here, Kotel, he is a master, Shaolin master, like freaking Steven Seagal.
Yeah.
Have you seen the video of Steven Seagal where he takes the people coming at him and he just kind of flips them over, and it's pretty movie-like in an actor
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, I would
I was
say
watching that
so.
video today. But no, I'm sorry. He's not a Shaolin master. He's not like Pai Mei from Kill Bill, although he does look like Pai Mei from Kill Bill. He's got the same facial hair and expressions. But he's here to teach us our five-finger death punch against Far Eastern philosophies. I'm kidding. All right, I'm going to shut up to quit being dumb. You have or are basically in process of completing a degree, if I recall, that relates to Far Eastern philosophy. Is that right?
Yeah, so my PhD really focuses on New Age religion
Hmm.
and spiritual but not religious, and then the use of psychedelics. And what I try to do is I work in the sort of subfield of new religious movements and argue for the use of psychedelics as its own new religious movement, rooting it then in the history of ideas coming out of the Western esoteric tradition, showing how the use of various intoxicants for inebriation, for the process of self-illumination is consistent within the tradition of magic, and then really how all these sort of ideas begin to amalgamate sort of postmodern understandings within the academy during the 20th century. All these things kind of congeal together in the 20th century to allow for the counterculture of the 1960s. And then moving into the 21st century, I argue that psychedelics, post Terence McKenna, post Leary, all this stuff is now its own new religious movement with its own paradigm and its own worldview, and trying to show where that stuff comes from.
Yeah, and that's a great topic. That's what we're going to talk about because I know a little bit about this arena. It's not my field, but as many of those who follow my work know, we have covered 4 or 5 of the psychonauts and their books in the Global Elite book series because this does play a big role in where the elite want to take Western civilization, and ultimately you could say a kind of a global pseudo-religion, if we want to call it that. Ties into the Global Elite book series. Maybe let's start it off with. Now, I've watched many, many, many of your videos and many of your longer talks
thanks,
where you've
man.
done really long explications of Far Eastern philosophy. How would you? I think most people in the West have these general ideas of like, oh, there's Zen and there's meditation and there's the idea, oh, we're all one, dude, and there's Maya. So people kind of have these vague ideas. How would you introduce maybe the whole of Far Eastern philosophy? How would you start us off in understanding the system before we move into the critiques?
Well, to begin, I would say that most people, I think, have very generalistic and ambiguous understandings of what Buddhism is.
Right.
And Buddhism is actually much more complex than most people give it credit for. And so before you can even get into Buddhism, though, you have to know what Hinduism is. Then to know what modern Hinduism is, you have to actually know what the Rig Veda is and the Vedic tradition is that predates Hinduism. And that's actually going to be the launching point for much of our conversation today on why the psychedelic community reaches back to even Tibetan Buddhism, specifically because it's a tantric form of Buddhism. Exactly. For a manual on the psychedelic experience. And Tantric Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism is going to be very different than all the various forms you're going to find on the island of Japan, Zen Buddhism, Shintoism, all these different things. And that's going to be very different than Pure Land and the forms that you're going to find on mainland China. And that's going to be very different than the Theravada Buddhism that spreads throughout Southeast Asia and moves in a general different direction, where Mahayana moves through northern, goes on to the Silk Road, and that's how it then enters China, and eventually Chinese people become Buddhists, and it kind of battles with Taoism and then Confucianism. It gets labeled as a religion, but it's not really a religion. It's more about a social organization and relationships. So Confucianism, I take a little bit of umbrage with it being categorized as a religion. It really has no transcendent values, and it's more about social organization and stuff like that. But to get into East Asian philosophy or theology, I would say you would need to probably begin with Hinduism, and then from a different approach, Taoism. And that's going to lead you to provide a sort of conceptual apparatus, then to understand Buddhism. Hinduism is going to be, we think about polytheism, the multiplicity of deities. A accurate way to think of Buddha or Hinduism is the crystallization of paganism. So even if you were to talk to Hindus, when we think about paganism, we think about people LARPing, of druids and stuff like this. But really what Hinduism is just a English term to describe pagan practices that situate themselves within the context of India. And so there's a great variety of what we would call Hinduism. And really it's going to end up being a sort of worship of nature. It's going to be a worship of creation. They're not going to have the sort of the distinctions between creator and creation. Mm-hmm. And we're going to see, I would argue, one of the fixtures of East Asian tradition is a cyclical understanding. Mm-hmm. And this is going to play really importantly in regards to epistemology and what's going to differentiate our worldview from a pagan worldview, from a Hindu worldview, from a Buddhist worldview, from a Taoist worldview, from all these different worldviews are going to be rooted within a cyclical understanding of nature, of time, of reincarnation, of the universe. Where we don't have that, we have beginning, middle, and end, and we have a distinction between creator and creation. And that's going to be fundamental from the get-go.
One question. We often hear about the idea of, you mentioned, I was going to ask you about like the cyclical view of the past, and monism and dualism. Are these kind of the dialectical swings that we will often see in these types of religions? And let me phrase it like this. Often we're told that these ancient Far Eastern religions, or even all religion, has an animistic origin. Like the ancient world was animistic, and then it evolved supposedly over time to be more of a philosophical speculation on abstracted principles of monism, dualism, numeric sort of principles. That's a characterization that we hear a lot in the history of comparative religion. Because I believe the biblical account, I don't exactly adopt that, but maybe in the sense of these ancient religions, is it the case that there was a more of a folkish animism that developed into the philosophical speculations, or how do you conceive of that going down, or do we even know?
Well, we definitely know within India. So the transition to what we would call Hinduism is a sort of, I hate to use the word, sort of evolution, but it's certainly a sort of progressive development where when we talk about the Vedic tradition predates. So we're talking about the Indus Valley civilization. We're going way back. We're going, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And we know that they practice a religious tradition which we would call a Vedic tradition. And that was based in a very important book called the Rig Veda. And it talks about really a personification of natural events. So you have Agni, the fire god. You have the sky god. You have this female goddess. You have all these gods which really are personifications of nature themselves. And tying into our conversation today, one of them is the god Soma, which is described as an intoxicant brew. And this is a whole discussion then within modern psychedelia is what is the Soma exactly? What is Soma? This Vedic god of ancient Hinduism that predates what we would consider Hinduism. It predates the Bhagavad Gita. It predates the Upanishads. The Upanishads are really where Hinduism becomes more philosophical. And so that's more recent. That's going to be post-Christ. That's already AD, but before the Upanishads are written. So before that, it's the Rig Veda. And really we see a sort of personification of natural events, one of which for our conversation today is a god called Soma, which is then present within a cup, and priests called Brahmins drink this cup and they become intoxicated, and then they have these revelations. So then you have the Terence McKenna, as you're highlighting with Food of the Gods, who believes this is the very common psilocybin. Go ahead.
Shroom.
Also within the context of India, and that it's tied to then the actual source of this intoxicant god back that was predated. Now, the whole Soma tradition actually gets annihilated out of Hindu practice, and it's believed that it was the Brahmins, so the priesthood, because you have a caste system in India, so it's very differentiated and segmented, the society, that the Brahmins in India wanted to keep this under wraps. They wanted to keep this secret under control. And so actually when they moved forward with new religious texts, with new traditions, with new empires, new kingdoms, they actually didn't talk about Soma. Soma begins to disappear. And this is why nobody knows actually what it is. We just have these hymns that are sung that are present within a book called the Rig Veda, which is very old and predates, again, what most people understand.
So it's entirely possible that it literally could have been crunk juice.
Yeah, it could. Who knows what it'd been?
Okay. Have you drunk it? Have you drunk this before?
No.
The juice of Sappho. Do you remember that? Are you a Dune fan?
No, I am not. I'm actually not.
Now that's a
familiar.
perennialist novel, and of course Dune is being remade, but it is by the juice of Sappho that the thoughts acquire speed, the lips acquire sand, the saints become warnings by will alone. I set my mind in motion. Boom, baby. How you like
Damn.
that? Anyway, I thought that was funny because I think there is I think Frank Herbert is referencing Soma when they have that ritual drink that the robot people drink in Dune.
Right.
But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, and the same thing, I think you've talked about Aldous Huxley and his discussion, isn't it in, well, doesn't he have a book? He has a book called Soma.
Yes.
And then he also has a sort of intoxicant brew.
It's the drug that everybody takes in Brave New World to
exactly.
to
That's what I was
be,
getting ready to say.
Passive and apathetic, basically.
Right. Which certainly we could even get into cannabis and how it. I think it also does that at a sort of societal level, being a female plant. So the male version of the cannabis plant is hemp, which is actually not intoxicant. So it has all the same properties. You can make paper products, all this different stuff out of the male side. The female side of the plant is actually how you get inebriated. And so when we see the feminization of society and the feminization of men, I think it's also tied to an over ingestion of cannabis itself.
Are you sure? Because I talked to I'm not joking. I talked to a hippie dude. I'm serious. Let me think. 2 days ago, because I was traveling through Chattanooga, and there was a store that we walked into down on a strip, and there was a dude in there, and he was like, "Yeah, man, I've been breeding and selling for 20 years, dude." And he's like, "I sold a strand to the military, dude." And he was selling these objects, and I was like, "How can you sell this? This is not legal." He's like, "No, we sell the flower, dude." And I'm like, well, the flower? He says, "Yeah, this is hemp. This is not weed. This is hemp." So I was confused because apparently he was claiming, I don't know, this was what this dude was saying, that the hemp flower has a very low THC. I don't understand. I'm confused.
It may have a very low amount, but I don't know anybody who's going and getting weed is getting hemp. I mean, it'd be so low, it probably isn't even worth it. I mean, when you're trying to get higher amounts of THC, you're going to get the female plant. So that's why I think it also has feminized qualities, which is interesting, and how I think it plays on society, right? Which is actually, I think, also going to be to a degree tied to our conversation today in the dissolution of the ego. So the whole dissolution of the ego, and the ego itself being a sort of phallic structure. It's the presence of the self at a psychological level. It erects itself. Like the ego, I think of it as erect, right? It's present in the world. It's not totally receptive. So it's sort of a masculine structure, just psychologically speaking. And so when we look at then the dissolution and the ego death, which this whole book is about, and then using the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a sort of guide manual, I think, again, this to a degree begins to, even in here, John Lennon talks about how he used Timothy Leary's crazy book, The Psychedelic Experience, and his experience after he dissolved his ego was that he didn't feel confident to make anything.
By the way, people in the chat are vindicating me. I'm not trying to debate you on it. I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't know about drugs and psychedelics, but the flower, the bud that grows upon the hemp, does have a small amount of THC.
Right, but nobody's really the flower.
No, there's
a
whole
flower
store.
is flower.
That's what I'm saying. There's a whole store in Chattanooga that sells that.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sure. Like, I'd be interested what the percentage is. I'm sure it's not in the 20% range where most people who are wanting to get cannabis are 20% THC or something like that. But no, I'm sure that there's some THC on the flower. I mean, that's what you smoke. But generally speaking, the male plant. And this is why Trump legalized like CBD through hemp. So here in the state of Indiana, you have all these CBD stores, but that's because it all comes from the male plant, not the female plant. So THC levels can never be too high because you're not getting it from the female plant.
I see. I didn't know that. Now we get back to these ancient Far Eastern texts and religions. So I have a book from Oxford. I don't know a whole lot about Hinduism, and so it's not like a single religious tradition. It's a bunch of different folkish ways that kind of have a confluence of intersections, and then that has these other Eastern religions that spring from it, correct?
Yep, exactly.
Now, one of the things that I don't even remember the guy's name. I wouldn't know how to pronounce it anyway. In this big fat Oxford book on the Vedas and whatnot, so he talks about there being stages in ancient Indian thought and philosophy, and one of the things that stuck out to me was that he says that there are periods when the Indian philosophers would really be pro-supernatural, and then they would kind of move into more of a naturalistic, anti-supernatural view, almost atheistic at times. And then he says they would also have these debates about whether everything was ultimately one or ultimately two or dyadic.
Yep.
Is that correct? Do they have these phases?
Yep. Well, definitely the debate between the duality and the monism is still present. And so the two schools, you have the Vedanta school, which believes that there's sort of an internal duality, although somehow within that they feel like they can reconcile that duality. And then they've always been in opposition what's called the Advaita Vedanta tradition, and this is the tradition that gets so popular in the West, where it's about absolute non-duality. And that real understanding is to recognize the duality as a sort of illusion, and that you have to transcend that, and it all goes back to Brahma. It all goes back to the one. And so they have been debating each other for a while as to, again, but that is much later. That's, again, with the Upanishads and all this different stuff, where Hinduism gets a little bit more philosophical and develops itself at a more philosophical level. So, but yeah, that's still present.
So why do you think the tendency is to spill over into these dialectical extremes of everything being one, or that particularity is somehow a lesser status of being? Like, what? I mean, this is going to lead to the notion of, the dissolution of ego that's going to be supposedly so profound. But why do you think that is? Like, what, why not say, oh, we all need to become, a piece of cheese? Like, why is it that we all need to become no thing?
Right. Well, certainly India would have been influenced by Alexander the Great, and so they would be influenced by Platonic thought, and so they would already have a sort of Platonic notion between materiality and immateriality, and so
Now, some
that
people will argue it's the other way around.
that Plato got it from
Yeah.
the Brahmas.
Well, from
Yeah.
Egypt, and then Egypt got it from there. What do you
Right. Either way, it's all working back on each other one way or another. And given it's all pagan thought, this is all sort of naturalistic theology anyway.
It's limited, right?
Yeah. So one way or another, it's just that Hinduism is greatly influenced by Alexander and the sort of openness to Greek culture that's going to be present within India at that time. So that's again where you're going to get a lot of the Upanishads and the more sort of philosophical developments of Hinduism.
Okay. Have you seen, by the way, The Man Who Would Be King?
What's that?
Well, I mean, it's a Rudyard Kipling story, but it's a Sean Connery movie. But Jamie and I, by the way, are going to be doing everybody a Connery stream pretty soon. We're going to pick out 5 fun Sean Connery movies, one of which will be the heavily Masonically influenced Man Who Would Be King. And in that, the 2 sort of con men Masonic characters go off into the mountains of Afghanistan to find a civilization where they can sort of dupe the locals. And they find a place that at one time was visited by Alexander and has this tradition that, Alexander the Great will return. It's a very kind of, it's the Kafir region of Afghanistan, and they have a local indigenous kind of pagan religion that was influenced, as you're mentioning, by the influence of Alexander's empire. And so Sean Connery basically figures out that, I can dupe these people by making them think that I'm the reincarnation of Alexander the Great. And so they try to set up themselves as sort of these kings of this local superstitious tribe. And it's a good allegory for the Masonic view of religion as kind of a tool of, Freemasonry and whatnot. But it actually is a good film. I've not read the Rudyard Kipling story, but it's him and Michael Caine. So it's a good movie. But it made me think of that because you have this notion of, even in that film, Alexander's empire stretching out to influence even these so far off, indigenous pagan Kafir. And the reason they're called the Kafirs is because that's infidel. And so that's the region of Afghanistan where Islam didn't penetrate. So they're still in that ancient Afghani, whatever pagan religion they have.
Right. And back then, most of that was Buddhist. That's why the Taliban destroyed so many Buddhist monuments in Afghanistan.
Well, that's the weird part, is because it seems more like the same way that Tibetan Buddhism takes on the local indigenous.
Yeah, the Bon tradition.
Yeah, so the Kafiri Buddhism is a pagan exoteric thing.
Yeah, and that's why Buddhism is so tricky to talk about, because you can say, well, Buddhism is atheistic, and you can say, it is. Right. But it's also theistic. Because as soon as you get into Tibetan Buddhism, now you have all these different gods, and so it's just really interesting. It has so many different schools, and it's very different. It's not as clean cut as like Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Protestantism. You have Theravada, you have Mahayana, you have Pure Land, you have Shingon Buddhism, which is a mixture of Shintoism, esoteric forms of magic, and then Chinese Buddhism. And that becomes the ritualistic religion of the emperors in China. And so when they wanted to perform magical rituals, when they wanted to affect the weather, when they wanted to win battles, they would bring in these Buddhist priests of the Shingon tradition, and then they would perform their rituals. And so that has deities, that has a goddess in it. So so Buddhism is very complex, and I think it needs more nuance when you talk about it. Not you, but just anybody, then I think some people in the West give it credit, because you can't just say a generalistic statement like, Buddhists don't believe in gods, which is true, but not all Buddhists believe that. If you're a Tibetan Buddhist, you actually do believe in gods, and you believe in the Dalai Lama, and he's on his 16th reincarnation.
I am the Buddha. Have you seen Little Buddha with Keanu Reeves?
No, dude, I'm terrible.
You should go watch this. It's hilarious. It's so bad it's funny, but so it takes place in, I don't know, 90s, and there's the 15th or 16th Dalai Lama, and they decide that he's a little kid somewhere, and then I don't remember who it is, Julianne Moore or somebody is like, doesn't believe that he's really the Dalai Lama, and so she goes to learn about it, and they rehearse to her the story, and it's Keanu Reeves that is Prince Buddha back in the day, and Keanu's always funny given his, because he's still kind of, Bill and Ted Keanu.
Right.
He's like, Dad, can I go out the city? No, my son.
That's where the Buddha sees suffering.
It's like suffering. And anyway, so yeah, Keanu goes out of the city as Anyway, it's just goofy. It's a serious film trying to tell the story of the Buddha in a serious way, but it's a goofy movie. But it made me think of that. So you've got the 8 pillars, and you got this the fleeing from suffering. I guess what I'm getting at is it correct to say? So here's the approach I usually say is these Far Eastern religions tend to fall over into monism or dualism. Would you say that's correct?
Yes, I would. Okay. As a paradigm, they either fall into those two groups.
Is it always the case, or are there like any weird fringe exceptions to that?
As a paradigm, I would say no, not really.
Interesting.
Because they all fit that. Whether you look at paganism or a crystallized form in terms of Hinduism, so it has all these different ritualistic texts and traditions, or you look at nature religion in regards to Shintoism in Japan, or you look at all the different forms of Buddhism, which there's a wide variety. It's still going to come down to a sort of monism, even within the forms of Buddhism that are advocating for absolute non-existence, the dissolution of suffering and desire and existence itself. It's still making essentialist claims, and by doing that, it already falls victim to a monistic paradigm.
Yeah, exactly. It's always seemed. Go ahead.
I was just agreeing with you. You can go ahead.
It's always seemed. I know that this is again dependent, of course, on our paradigm, but to me, it's always seemed just outright demonic. The idea that the highest level of enlightenment is your own dissolution. Now, in a sense, what do we mean by dissolution of the ego? If you mean the, which I don't think they mean, but a person might intend to mean what we as Orthodox mean by that, something like becoming dispassionate, becoming, not enslaved to the passions or our vices. They might mean that by the dissolution of the ego, or the false self that we set up as a result of egoism and the fall, basically. I mean, this is the doctrine of the fall, the worship of the self. But typically they don't really mean that, because most Westerners or most, psychonauts, when they go do the trip, it's like the death of the ego actually becomes like, oh, dude, I'm a guru now, dude. I've seen into reality. So if you want to know what's really going on, come to me, bro. And it has the opposite effect. It makes for a completely delusional, bro, I'm God type of complex.
Right. No, I would definitely agree with the ego death actually bringing the ego back stronger and stronger each time, because it substantiates the individual that somehow they've accessed unknown realms that other people haven't. Therefore, they have access to esoteric knowledge. Therefore, they have gnosis that other people don't.
Yes.
Therefore, they're more illuminated than other people can be. Therefore, their ego is bigger than anybody else's ego. And that's why they think they're God.
Yeah. I mean, if you've ever been around, and I grew up, I'm sure like everybody else did, around people who love to trip balls, and everybody, bro, I've tripped like 55 times this year, dude. Like, I've seen into reality, right? And it's like, come on, man. And what they say is their great revelation is literally the same shit that pagan religions have said for millennia.
Right.
I've never heard, a hardcore tripper ever say anything profound. Literally, I've never heard anything profound from these people.
Well, I think for sure they don't perceive the world at a paradigmatic level. And I would say that the whole tradition of the use of psychedelics, illuministic frameworks of a spirituality, they all move you away from the use of logic itself for the acquisition of truth. It pushes you back towards a more phenomenologically rooted epistemology. Therefore, it's all based in your experience, because you're going into these altered realms. Well, now we can take how we access truth out of more objective forms, place them in more subjective forms, which then re-elevates our own ontology and who we think we are, and moves us epistemologically towards relativism itself.
Yeah, you said it better than I could have said it. Exactly. That's what I was going for, and you nailed it right there. I mean, and that was my own experience, right? When I, had my bad trip and then subsequent trips, I remember thinking, oh, wow, I've really seen into reality. And that's the delusion that it gives, is that because it's this overwhelming, spectacle and sensory sort of experience, the eyes, the flashing lights, the melting, the breathing walls, all this kind of stuff, the emotions, the laughter, that gives the impression that this is all real, in the sense of the phenomena of the experience replace the content of the experience. Because then afterwards, when you ask people, well, what was the big revelation? You can never really put, well, it was like, everything was so pretty, and you could just see the sparkles, and there's not really anything substantial there. So the appearance of depth is what's going on here, and not any real depth. And I think you stated it perfectly there, that it's moving you away from the notion of objective truth, of logic, and kind of replacing it with just the phenomenal and the experiential.
Right, because the radical nature of these experiences definitely happen to somebody. So again, the conflating experience with truth, that somehow they're one and the same thing. And we see then the approach is very ambiguous. So like even within our book here, where he on page 97 talks about this is now how the instructions, how the manual is to be used. Right at the beginning, we have the name of the voyager. And I thought this was so apropos for Orthodox theology. So just in like the first 5 lines there, so you're trying to, this is for, if you're leading somebody through a trip, right? They've taken psychedelics. Now you're leading them through these realms of the bardos, these states of death. The first one, what you begin to say, so they've already taken the drug, you say, name of voyager. So John Smith. Oh, John Smith, the time has come for you to seek new levels of reality. Your ego in the John Smith game are about to cease. You're about to face with the clear light. So you're about to be face to face with something that's ambiguous and has no personhood. What is the
Lucifer,
clear light? How does it have a face?
You're about to see the light of Lucifer.
Exactly. So it goes. So then from an Orthodox paradigm of always beginning your theology with personhood, we see here that they're trying to destroy the personhood in the individual and access for the validity of God in this ambiguous state of light, which is totally different from the hesychast and how we would
say
understand.
It's a reverse hesychia, isn't it? So God is light. Yes. God is uncreated light. Lucifer is an angel of light, and he's the mimic. He's the inverse of that. God, of course, being the loving, personal God. And then it only stands to reason that what Lucifer would want to promote is this sort of impersonalism, this idea that, oh, no, you need to dissolve the hypostasis of who you are into this, I don't know, impersonal nothingness, nirvana, whatever it is.
Right. No, and that lack of personhood, then when we look at Buddhism or even when we look at Hinduism, we can see, okay, interesting. These East Asian traditions are actually moving in the opposite direction in regards to this notion of personhood. That Buddhism is actually, suffering is tied to your personhood. Oh, wow. And so really in Buddhism, you still want to destroy that ultimately. And that full enlightenment, full Satori, to be the guru figure is to actually no longer have that. And so we see then more.
By the way, did you notice that it mentions the void?
Yeah.
I mean, in our theology, the void, the abyss, that's
hell.
Not where you want to go. You don't want to be in the abyss. This says, make your ego become the abyss.
Right. And that's where I think the theology of this stuff is so interesting. And that's why it fits so nicely within the Western esoteric tradition of magic itself. I mean,
now
because
how do you make that connection there for us?
okay. So, so you're talking about Lucifer. I mean, where does Luciferianism come from, other than the secret societies, post-Renaissance magic? Right. So we got Ficino, Hermeticism, all this stuff. So then moving past that, post-Reformation, now we have these secret societies. We have all these. We see Protestantism smash out the mystical dimensions of Christianity in favor of like this austere rationalism. And in so doing, the mysticism presents itself in Northern Europe in the form of magic. And so we get Masonry, we get Rosicrucians, we get all these secret societies.
Exactly, yeah.
And so we get all these secret societies, and it's in these notions of theology, which are going to be monistic. It's going to be anti-personhood. It's going to be all about illumination. It's going to be all about one's realizing they are God. So then we can see the presuppositions of magic itself are rooted within the psychedelic spirituality.
Wait a minute. How did you get from the Western post-Enlightenment Renaissance to psychedelics?
So the use of intoxicants was already there. So within the alchemists,
you're saying the Renaissance guys were tripping balls.
Well, that is debated, but we do know they were smoking opium. And so we do know, for example, like Paracelsus, a very famous alchemist, that he and there was alchemists named Dr. Opiatus. And that what they would do is they would smoke opium, then they would look into the retorts, they would look into their experiments, and then the reflections from is the whole mythology of the amalgamation and the distillation and all these different alchemical terms. It's sort of it's like a materialistic form of psychology. And that's why Jung was so interested in alchemy. And he loved this. It related to his idea of archetypes and symbolism and projections of the psyche. And so the alchemists were all about getting into altered states to re-perceive reality and gain gnosis to a degree. When you get into
Crowley is a great example of that, by the way.
Exactly, and that's later 19th, 20th century, later 19th century. But even earlier than that, we see a book by, I think it's Berthelot, The Hashish Eater. And this is about, in Paris, they had all the opium dens. Oh, well, there you go. And the writers in the early 19th century, they would go eat cannabis. They would get it out of Northern Africa. And then they'd go to these dens and they would eat it. And then they would describe what would sound like an LSD experience. And so they were essential in the Western esoteric tradition and the development of these ideas. And so when I look at presuppositions and I'm just thinking, okay, well, so what are some of the fundamental presuppositions of the psychedelic spirituality? Well, we see man have a higher ontology, that somehow he is one with the universe. He is God. He needs to become enlightened. That's going to be tied then to a monistic understanding of the universe itself. And then we're going to see the sort of inebriation as a way in which to allow one to sort of access these forms of reality, to perceive it as it really is. So
Dr. Opiata sounds like a villain, like a Spider-Man villain or something.
I know it does.
But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You have to put up with the bad joke interjections when you come on here. I'd like to read just a little bit more of this just for the sake of the audience and you can get an idea of what we're talking about. And thank you to David for pulling up that page 97. He says, "O name of Voyager, the time has come for you to seek new levels of reality. Your ego and the Bill Cosby game are about to cease. You are about to be set face to face with the clear light. You are about to experience it in its reality. In this ego-free state, wherein all things are like the void and the cloudless sky, the naked and spotless intellect is like a transparent vacuum. At this moment, you will know yourself and abide in that state." By the way, if you are a Twin Peaks fan, you will recall that when Leland is dying in the police station, what does Agent Cooper say to him? He says that. So Cooper is being the bardo instructor to Leland when Leland's dying, because Cooper is obsessed with Tibetan Buddhism. And he reads that. He says, in this ego state, you will be like the void in the cloudless sky, naked and spotless intellect. And he says, at this moment, know yourself and abide in that state. That's literally what Cooper says to Leland. But, Bill Cosby, that which is the ego death is coming to you. Remember, this is now in the hour of death and rebirth. Take advantage of the temporary death to obtain the perfect state of enlightenment. Concentrate on the unity of all living beings. Hold on to that clear light. So there's your monism. Use it to attain the understanding and love. If you cannot maintain the bliss of this illumination, if you are slipping back into contact with the external world, remember the hallucinations that you now experience, the visions and the insights, they will teach you much about yourself and the world. The veil of routine perception will be torn from your eyes. And remember the unity of all living things. Once again, back to the monistic. And then it goes back down. And, remember the light, the clear light, the true light. So you get this appeal to the fact that this drug trip is going to be an initiatic experience. It's going to tell you about, the nature of reality basically being monism and everything being this impersonal sort of light force, right?
Right. And that fits nicely then where this paradigm bridges, because the psychedelics are obviously accessing Tibetan Buddhism as a way in which to sort of validate their own presuppositions in spiritual theology. But when we're talking about Timothy Leary, we're also talking about somebody that has a different paradigm, I would argue, than like an Alan Watts. Timothy Leary is deeply embedded within the scientific paradigm. And so then the LSD, what it's doing is it's activating the neurons in your brain. You see that he has a very materialistic understanding of much of this stuff. He has a very Jungian understanding of the spirituality. This is psychological. These are symbolic formations. This is all your mind, right? He repeats throughout this book multiple times that you have to realize this is all your mind doing it. So then it comes back to this idea of where all is consciousness. And he's rooting it in. So even when he gets out of prison, for those of you who don't know Timothy Leary, it is useful to know that 1950s, he graduated from Berkeley, California as a PhD in psychology, was a professor there. Early 60s, he gets a job over at Harvard. It's around 62. He has his first mushroom experience in Mexico. He believes that this is the future, and he goes back to Harvard, begins to do his research with a friend of his named Richard Alpert, who later becomes Ram Dass. And then he had another colleague named Ralph Metzner, who actually he was at the CIS, or the California Institute for Integral Studies. That's where he was. He's actually passed away now. But they then get into the famous psychedelic research at Harvard. That all comes to an end when Richard Alpert, who is now a closet homosexual, their only thing, Harvard said they could do these experimentations. They did them for over a year, but you cannot have any undergraduates. It has to be graduate students. But Ram Dass, being a professor at Harvard, being a closet homosexual, falls sexually in infatuation with an undergraduate student. They have a fling. He participates in one of the rituals. That's what gets the whole thing shut down. Now we're looking at we're at 1963, early 1960s.
I got a question here.
Yeah.
So you say the rituals, is that connected to the gay love, like a Crowleyan ritual, or what do you mean?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Timothy Leary was actually very he would, in today's terms, he'd be considered a homophobe.
Oh.
But so him and Richard Alpert actually had a bit of a break for a while because he would, I guess, deride or mock him for being a homosexual.
I see. But now Leary was super into Crowley, or was that just,
yes, he was.
Was he
so
really?
Terence
Was he
McKenna.
actually into him, or was he like in the pop culture way of like, Jay-Z thinks he's into Crowley or something?
I don't know. I would say that Leary really believed in the sort of Crowleyan theology of do what thou wills, and that man is God.
Okay.
So, and I would say that's what I was trying to highlight with the differentiation between Timothy Leary and an Alan Watts. Is Alan Watts has very pejorative notions about science, right? He's much more in the sort of wishy-washy, feely, sort of spiritual understanding. Timothy Leary is much more sort of psychological, scientific, even though he will be a sort of guru figure. He's interested in, he's a very sort of scientific guy. Even when he gets out of prison. So that's what I was trying to say. So 63, he gets fired from Harvard. Technically, Richard Albert got fired, and Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner went with him. Interesting. No, they actually didn't get fired. It's Richard Albert that got fired for having a gay fling with a student and then allowing him to participate in their experiments. So they then go
about. So Ram Dass comes up in Daniel Pinchbeck's introduction to the book. I didn't know any of that.
Yeah, and Ram Dass, he then, as it Daniel Pinchbeck highlights, goes to India. He then has a sexual relationship with his guru, and then he throughout the rest of his life he never got married, and he claimed to be like bisexual or something like that. So Timothy Leary, 63, they're now out of Harvard, and they're looking for a place to continue all these rituals, because you have to understand, they were becoming very popular. Psychedelics were legal. Psychedelics were not illegal in the United States until 1964. So in 1963, you could go to the Bay Area, you could go to a tobacco shop, and you could buy LSD. You can buy the stuff like you could. And so it wasn't until 1964 where that stuff's all made illegal. And so 63, the end of 63, I think November of 63 is when C.S. Lewis, Aldous Huxley, they both die. And when does JFK die? Is that 63 as well? And when does MLK die? Is that 63, 64? Anyways,
no, JFK is alive because he's on the island with Tupac and Elvis, and Big.
So they go to this famous mansion in upstate New York, and it's called the Melbrook Mansion. And so Peggy Hitchcock was she was an heiress to a very, very wealthy family. They had this huge mansion in upstate New York, and basically they took their operation at Harvard and moved it to there for a couple years. And there's a great book actually by Arthur Klepps. He was part of all this stuff, but he wrote a book documenting his experience. So it's like a first person sort of book about his time in basically the early 1963, and then Timothy Leary getting kicked out, him getting into these drugs, and then him moving to the Melbrook Mansion and doing all this stuff. So it's very interesting reading because it's a firsthand account of what they were doing, what type of rituals they were doing, the famous people that they were encountering. And so they were there for a while.
Who?
The famous people?
Yeah.
Oh, it was a who's of musicians.
Okay.
I mean, all the musicians wanted Timothy Leary to initiate.
It was a who's who of the who.
Yeah, but certainly the Beatles were one. I mean, musicians, they would ask Leary to lead them through basically what we're looking at here. And so they wanted to have the ego death. They wanted to have this full-blown psychedelic experience. Again, Timothy Leary, he's getting liquid forms of LSD. This is top quality stuff. So then they can come there, he can dose them up, and then he can lead them through these rituals. And that came to an end about at 66.
Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean, mate? Do you know what I mean?
He moves to California, the Bay Area. And so that's where we see the Summer of Love is 1967. And so we see the whole sort of psychedelic stuff move from the East Coast, where it really got started, to the West Coast, the mid 60s. And so we see, because even Woodstock is New York. So that's 69. 67 is the Summer of Love. That's in the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. But the Haight-Ashbury stuff, that's all 66, 67, 68. But and then it's 1972. Timothy Leary, what most people don't realize, he becomes the most wanted man in the world, in America, at one point, because he escaped prison. So he got arrested. The Weathermen, the sort of leftist, progressive terrorist of the 1960s, they rescued him or helped him break out of prison. And this was. This is the late. I swear, Timothy Leary, he climbed a telephone wire hand over hand to a pole, shimmied down the pole, and they had a car waiting for him. They booked it, and then he went to Algeria and was avoided extradition by the Black Panthers who were there in Algeria, and then he's trying to figure out how he can.
A bunch of feds. I mean, I can't imagine actually pulling this off without some kind of like Fed aid or something. I mean,
possible. He gets arrested in I think it's Kabul, Afghanistan. And so he's trying to figure out how he can like meet up with a lot of these other people or try to find a place where he can continue to do his research. And they find out about him, and he gets arrested, and then he goes back to prison, and that's in like 1972. And then he's there for few years. And then eventually he gets out, and he's all about transhumanism. He's all about technology. He's all about psychedelics and transhumanism actually leading people to the same point. And so transhumanism and technology is a psychedelics through materiality. And so then we can see Silicon Valley, all this stuff, it's all blending together. It's all the same presupposition and paradigm.
Wow. By the way, this also connects to the origins of the internet, because there's similar characters who are involved in the Esalen Institute who are also connected to like Pentagon and Silicon Valley that are imagining at this time the internet. Have you heard of this?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that would make sense with what you're saying about Leary, right? So perhaps Leary knew about this stuff, and we're all gonna be connected, man. And this is,
I think he did.
Okay.
And I think that's why even in this book we hear a lot of talking about the game. I can't help but think that that's related to game theory, which comes from John von Neumann.
That's how you get chicks, man. I'm gonna have to tell you about my game, how to get game later on, but I'm just joking.
But John von Neumann, who then talked about the architect of the internet,
right,
computers, all this different stuff. Well, he developed game theory,
right,
and to me, it sounds like Leary's already influenced by a lot of this stuff.
Wow, right. So the quantification of everything under game theory leads to the logic of the noosphere and the Internet of Things, which ultimately I think is kind of what they were imagining a long time ago, was a simulation of all that's occurring. And lo and behold, Klaus is now telling us this in his Great Reset book, that's of course, yes, all along, that's where things have been going. So, we got you. You thought that the internet was given to you because the deep state loves you and they're your friends and they want you to have, high-level cryptographic technology that allows you to do things that wizards did 1,000 years ago by looking into their magic mirrors. The little sorcerers and wizards did this. Now you can do it. You too can be a wizard if you only follow my 5-step instruction. Trip your balls off and become an initiate. Anyway, I'm going crazy,
right.
but I spent too much time with Alex, and now I'm going crazy. I'm going spurging out, going crazy.
But what you just said with like Klaus, we see all the same presuppositions. Man is God. Man can dictate new structures of reality. So gender, just an easy one. That the multiplicity of gender is rooted within the paradigm that there is no superior authority outside man and his creation. And so that is also tied with, hermetic understandings of man being the brother of God, which is tied to the magical thought of man needing to become the magician, the wizard, really God incarnate, which is tied to, again, it's all monism. So globalism, the internet, these are all rooted within a monistic paradigm because you're thinking about entrapment or oneness of all this different stuff.
Yeah, I was reminded, looking back at, both Pinchbeck in his essay in the introduction here and Terence, as well as all these guys, they say quite a bit in their little essays. For example, Leary says, and I'll point this out here in a minute, I pointed out in the previous talks when we covered these books, that Leary says that he holds a couple figures in high regard. One of them is Crowley. He says Crowley's one of the characters, along with John C. Lilly, that everybody needs to pay attention to.
Yep.
Pinchbeck says this is the initiation of the masses. That's what's so amazing, is that the 1960s themselves, he says, are a shamanic initiation. Of course, I've been saying that seems to have been the case all along. I spent a lot of time in the last 10 years, of course, researching and reading about MK Ultra, all the different projects, all the different books on that. And one of the things I kept coming back to was like, well, this is almost like a mass initiation. In fact, one of our big global elites that we covered, none other than Fritjof Capra himself, says in one of the chapters on the return of hallucinogens that is really this is really a return of shamanic initiation for the masses. And you can think of something like Burning Man as a great example of the shamanic initiation. And who hangs out at Burning Man and has
the tech elite,
their own secret society at Burning Man, the Silicon Valley elite.
Yep. And Bay Area. So when I moved to the Bay Area, one of the interesting things about looking at spirituality and like new forms of spirituality, the most common form of spirituality in the Bay Area is magic, often thelemic forms of magic.
No, dude, you're talking about Magic the Gathering, dude. Flipping some cards.
No, I'm talking about naked women on altars, Gnostic masses, stuff like that.
That level?
Yeah. I went to one. People want to hear that story.
Yeah, but what about the Bay Area rappers, dog? Like E40.
But
actually, the Bay Area rappers are probably involved in the.
I wouldn't doubt it, dude.
Exactly.
I would not doubt it. It was so interesting to find out how popular magic and magical theories are for people's spiritual outlets in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area, generally speaking, but very much in Silicon Valley, which is tied to the microdosing, the use of psychedelics, and all this different stuff. Again, and so we can see then the inflation of the ego, as we've already talked about. Why they're so confident in their censorship is they've already have the sense of self that they have the gnosis. They've gone to realms. They know, you don't know. They know better. Mm-hmm. They're doing things for the betterment of the world, for the betterment of globalism, for the betterment of the globe. All these different things already rooted within their worldview. The same things we've already discussed with the psychedelics. So I see the transhumanist movement and Silicon Valley and psychedelics all branches from the same tree.
Yeah, that's a great point. I noticed that in Pinchbeck's introductory essay, he notes the connection to the UN. He notes the connection to... He does the same thing that McKenna does, where he sets up this false dichotomy between natural drugs like mushrooms versus the big pharma. But who developed LSD, by the way? Oh, big pharma, exactly. People don't know that Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, they had a direct hand in the development of this stuff. Gordon Wasson, whom is mentioned, of course, by McKenna. I mean, Wasson worked at the behest of the CIA. Time magazine promoted all of this stuff on the cover of Time magazine back in the day to help promote the countercultural revolution. And so a lot of people are unaware of that still. Right,
and also our Gordon Wasson wasn't just working for the CIA. He was a high-level worker, for J.P. Morgan.
Exactly.
So we see how the globalist financial institutions they're all tied together within this stuff.
By the way, somebody said, "Why are you acting like a Southern tough guy and interrupting the guest?" I actually am a Southern person. I'm not a tough guy. I'm just a spurg, and I spurg out and act crazy and do voices. That's the normal me. And David and I are buddies, so this is not some sort of trap to stick it to the man, David Patrick Harry. We're gonna stick it to that dude. He says it's the return of animism, pantheism, and the mythological archetypes, and it's all couched, by the way, in the context of, yeah, man, we're the revolutionaries. We're gonna fight the system. We're gonna fight the man. And I think that's all BS. Now, I'm not calling into question, maybe Daniel Pinchbeck sincerely believes that. He's been actually on a lot of shows of people that I've been on shows with. I've never talked to Daniel Pinchbeck. I don't know him personally. I have friends that know him and are on good terms with him. I'm not trying to be mean to him. I don't know him. Right. But I don't think that a lot of the people who promote the counterculture, quote unquote, ideas, I don't think they really realize how much of a top-down promotion they get. In other words, I don't think
they do either.
Yeah, a lot of
I think a lot of them perceive themselves as still the counterculture of the 60s.
Exactly.
And so and that's part of the branding. That's part of the paradigm, really. The paradigm of the psychedelic spirituality is somehow you are assuming a position that is just too radical for society, and that you are on the outs.
Mm-hmm.
And really what it is doing is, and so where I would agree with Pinchbeck and with a lot of the psychedelic people is the problems with Protestantism.
Yes,
Allow the
I
vacuum for psychedelics to fill that mystical void in our society, because as they're talking about, we don't have initiations. We don't have ritualistic rites of passages. We don't even have real mysticism.
Great point. I was going to say that he did make a good point there. Where was it? I made a note of it. Something about the loss of the notion of the mystical, the loss of the mythological. Now, I'm not equating, orthodoxy with the mythological, but you could use mythology in the way that like C.S. Lewis does it, where you're speaking of the grand narrative story that we're told.
Yes.
And so that is why people are finding materialism, rank empiricism, boring atheism so sort of dry and barren and boring. Is that's why they have the turn then towards the mystical in the sense of the shamanic or the pagan. I mean, by the way, we keep we tend to forget that like there's all this new neo-folk pagan revival that's going on.
Yep.
I mean, largely through a lot of internet stuff, but all of these trolls that come on here and troll me all the time. But so that's another element of this where people are turning to alternate forms of the mystical. Maybe they don't care about the New Age, but then let me get into my Volkish tradition or whatever. But it's just LARPing in the sense that do you want that? Do you want Shirley MacLaine in the New Age? Do you want Ram Dass? Do you want go find a guru that you could sit under here? Go test out your shamanic, and you should go down to Peru, hang out with Tristan, and Tristan's a little stable of boomers that he's got down there that get duped by the brujos down there in Ecuador, right? But I'm saying it's like it's like there's a consumerist element. I think you've covered this.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, just the way that it's interacting, the way in which psychedelic spirituality, really contemporary Western spirituality, the way in which it operates is a consumeristic tendency to just grab things and elements that it likes from all the different world religions. And so again, we see the perennialistic yearnings in the psychedelic movement, and it is all sort of consumerism in the name of not being a consumer. And again, it shows you how you're still buying the package, the way the hippie dress, the way they present themselves, the way they talk, it's all a package. And even when I was deep into the psychedelic movement, I never was quote unquote a hippie. I was still always kind of into guns and like just normal masculine stuff, sports, stuff like that. Even though I was really big into the psychedelics and the hippie culture per se, I never dressed, or nobody would look at me and think, wow, you're a hippie. But that whole culture is subsumed within that worldview, and it's purchasing. You purchase the Buddhist beads to wrap around your wrist. You purchase the t-shirts. You purchase the shampoo or the lack of shampoo for your dreadlocks. I mean, it's all consumerism. And
you got to buy all that expensive organic shit, dude. You go to the freaking Whole Foods, bra, and it's like you just spent, like, what was the old joke people in Nashville used to call it, whole check instead of Whole Foods, because you spent your whole check to go to Whole Foods.
That's hilarious. But yeah, I definitely think it's tied up with consumerism. Right. I think really, I would agree with much of Max Weber's critique when you go back to the Protestant work ethic, and he's talking about Protestant theology itself is allowing for the erection of capitalism. Oh, now, there's plenty of things that I would disagree with Max Weber and his worldview, but I think generally that premise is correct. Mm-hmm. And that's why we see the capitalistic forms of economy take off in Northern Europe. And we can even see such a distinction between the labor force of Southern Europe and Northern Europe, how much more productive Northern Europe is versus the sort of lax atmosphere and culture of Southern Europe. Yeah. Well, that was also the split of Protestant North and Catholic South. And within that Northern Protestant theology, there is this notion of working hard, building, even Max Weber talks about theories of predestination being tied with concepts of capitalism and stuff like that, and the haves,
right,
not.
Because economic blessing signifies, in some degree, the blessing of being one of the elect and so forth.
Right. So how far of a stretch is it to get Joel Osteen inside the former Houston Rockets stadium? I mean, it's all the same it's just the natural flow of these presuppositions and where they would eventually go.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we get Western society, 20th century, mid-century Western society. So we're looking at the 1960s. You have this sort of dying formal Protestant worldview, and then you have this very lively and active new counterculture that is totally in opposition to it, and it's splitting society. People are realizing now, in the 21st century, that they don't really have an identity. And so when you're talking about LARPing as pagans or sort of their getting tied into their racial distinctions, so then the wingnats are again worshiping materiality. They're worshiping creation, and that's why they're so embedded within their own race. Not that we can't talk about race in a very conscientious way.
Gods in my veins, bro.
Right, because they don't have a real transcendent identity, and that's why then their only resolution is go back
into the biological ultimately.
Yeah, so that's all they have to resort to now. And it's like they were red pilled. They see what's going on. They see all these things in society. They see all the problems from the Protestant theology, from the capitalism, from the consumerism, or the socialism. I mean, again, anybody who's played Monopoly, the dichotomy between capitalism and socialism is dumb. It leads to the same thing.
And I can't believe that people haven't figured out that these pop-up movements, anytime you see something newly popping up on the internet and it's this brand new thing and it's fake. It's fake, dude. Any new movement is fake. I guarantee you. So a resurgence of neo-paganism, you think that's not run by a bunch of social engineers and feds? I'm sorry, but it is.
Exactly.
Let me ask you this question, because this comes up all the time when this topic is in the air. I'm going to play the part of the sort of skeptic person who's not maybe liking your take.
Okay.
David, isn't it? I mean, look, why are you hating on these drugs? They oftentimes foster people's religious, quote unquote, experiences. Perhaps it's a bad trip, but it also gets people into the point where they question their identity, they question their false self. Why is that a bad thing? Why do you have a problem with that?
So I don't have a problem with people having mystical experiences or questioning the nature of authority or questioning the validity of their own culture and tradition. However, the way in which these substances are used lead people into a paradigm which cannot be true at the fundamental level. And therefore, I think that needs to be talked about, that needs to be highlighted, and that needs to be discussed as a detriment to these substances. That, again, it leads to monistic understanding. It leads to perennialism. It leads to a consumeristic use of spirituality. Yeah. And therefore, you never really develop spirituality. I did a whole video on horizontal versus verticality in regards to forms of spirituality. You have to be rooted in a single tradition to go upwards. Now, again, I don't think all traditions actually go upwards, but the point is, if you're always just grabbing things like a smorgasbord, how are you elevating oneself towards a creator of the universe? You're not. What you're doing is, again, worshiping yourself. And therefore, you're finding things that validate already the things that you believe to be true, who you think you are. And it leads to, and so the dissolution of boundaries, which these substances do. And the part that I struggle with as an Orthodox is like, well, how do I talk about, obviously, inebriation, our virtue of sobriety, our Christian virtue of sobriety comes from Stoicism. Inebriation, therefore, is a sin. How do I reconcile that with maybe a military guy who has PTSD and does some type of therapy and actually finds healing in the dissolution of boundaries to get over their PTSD or whatever? But the dissolution of boundaries themselves is what's leading people to relativism. So boundaries are dissolving in a conceptual, experimental, phenomenological level for the individual when they go into these psychedelic states. When they come out of that state, they take then on these presuppositions of boundary dissolution. So you see the multiplicity of genders being tied to this stuff.
I want
dissolution
boundaries.
of boundaries.
Yes, I do not want to be one with your bunions. I want boundaries. I'm not your bunion. I will never be your bunion. Right? I mean, boundaries are a good thing.
Globalism, the dissolution of national boundaries, the dissolution of racial boundaries, right? So we see the whole interracial relationship stuff. All this stuff is tied, I would say, to the social organization, and why psychedelics are so useful to the implementation of these things, because you get people to experience phenomenologically the dissolution of boundaries. Therefore, they come to this realization that everything is one. Therefore, monism, perennialism, all this stuff is now rooted in their worldview. It's going to be very difficult for them to get out of because they experienced it as real. They're not going to be using the laws of logic or logical fallacies to then debunk their own experience. So they are going to then adopt permissive, juvenile forms of epistemology. And they're going to fall victim to a worldview that's all about the dissolution of boundaries themselves. Yeah. And that's what's happening. And that's so the anti-police stuff. I mean, it's not that they're conscientious of this stuff. It's that the paradigm of globalism itself is the dissolution of boundaries, which I think theologically ties to the original sin. And, the euphemism, the greatest trick the devil ever played is to convince people he didn't exist. Well, in a world where right and wrong can't be differentiated, that's exactly where he reigns supreme. And so in the globalist structure with the dissolution of all boundaries, and then all new boundaries then are erected by man. There's no God-created boundaries. It's man's created boundaries. That is the realm in which Satan is entirely in control and reigns supreme.
Yeah, but who are you to say what's true, man? I just think that's a really ego-based thing for you to say that, like, you know what's true or whatever. Like, I mean, your ego must just be like to the moon, dude. That's typically the kind of answer that you would get.
It really is. Yeah. It really is, and that's what.
As if that statement wasn't saying what's true.
Right, and that's what's so sad is that it's funny because they are, I would say, generally speaking, some of them. I mean, I think the Orthodox community, at least my experience with a lot of the Ortho bros, very well-read individuals. Mm-hmm. My experience with a lot of the people deep into psychedelics are typically well-read, mm-hmm. but the sophistication of, and this is where, again, I really liked your apologetics, and it helped shake me out of these comfortable places in which the psychedelics take you at a worldview, is then using the laws of logic, using logical fallacies, using objective methods to try to get at what's true, because that then plays in favor to our worldview. And it validates the paradigm that we use as true. And then using those methods, we can debunk the other paradigms.
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of absurd and childish, like you said, to retreat into this. Oh, well, I'm anti-Western, so I don't accept Western logic, and maybe your Western logic builds rockets and bridges and skyscrapers or whatever, but my Eastern logic shows me that I'm one with everything. Okay, well, yeah, good luck with that. I mean, that's not going to get you very far, because you can't balance your checkbook with Eastern logic where you're not different from these other types of things. That's just absurd. But that's falling into dialectics, and I think that what those types of systems, which ironically, if you look at certain like Zen ideas, they actually have the intention of getting beyond dialectics.
Yes.
Which is odd, because that's kind of true. However, they can't do it because by the logic dictated within that system, the transcending of dialectics is actually in the dissolution of all particulars, and that's the problem.
Right. Yes. And you're still with then in their avoidance of the dualism or the dialectics, they end in then a monism of all is consciousness, all is nothingness. These are all essentialist claims. So then you're in a monistic worldview, which still implies duality, which still has a sort of dialectical tension, because as soon as you make an essentialist claim of whatever you're claiming, if it's that, it's not the opposite. Now you're stuck and you're back in the same problem. And so they go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that they can't get out of their own way, and using logic, using an uncreated energy of the logos allows us to see that, allows us to highlight that, and then allows us to see that the Orthodox paradigm, it is collapsing of the dialectics. That's what's so beautiful about it. Like the both and, God being omnipotent, but God also is assuming human nature and self-limiting himself in the kenosis. Like everything is always collapsing the dialect. It's so beautiful.
Christology does that often. The Trinity does that often. Essence, energy, distinction is beyond dialectics. I mean, this is what St. Gregory Palamas is referring to, the logical antinomies. And then Losky in his writings is consistently talking about that orthodoxy is affirming the reality and existence of logic at a certain level and as applicable to the created order, but God, of course, transcends the logical antinomies. And so it's, again, oftentimes, not in every case, but oftentimes it's a both and not an either or. And I want to give a shout out, by the way, to our good friend, Jim Bob. This is a Jim Bob original here. Be sure and follow Made by Jim Bob out there on Instagram and at his website. By the way, we almost had 500. We got up to 465 nerds, so almost to 500 nerds.
Nice.
In here with your boy Kotel. I'm your southern tough guy who interrupts a lot, Jay Dyer, and you can support me as well by subscribing to the website at the link in the show description, and also be sure and follow our friend David Patrick over at Church of the Eternal Logos. His links are in the show description as well. Let me ask you this question, because this comes up all the time too. I wanted to get your take on it. Oftentimes people say, hey, look, dude, what about the legitimate medical use of these things? Is there a legitimate medical use of these things? Is there like, let me think of a case where I could speculate that maybe it could work. Let's say I know a person who's like a super alcoholic. Like they're at the point where they're going to drink themselves to death. Is there a place for like a last resort? Like, maybe you should do this, dude. Like, there's no other hope for you. It's not going to make you worse, in other words. Or would it make the person worse? I don't know. I mean, do you think that literally is there a place for this kind of stuff or not?
My takeaway from, again, those of you who are familiar with my stuff know that I had a previous YouTube channel. I was deep into the psychedelics, did a lot of psychedelics. Is it depends so much on the individual. And this is why I'm very skeptical about just mass legalization of psychedelics or something like that, because it really has a lot to do with your own psyche. It has a lot to do with your childhood. And, like if you come from a broken home, you have abuse that you've had to deal with, and then you take psychedelics at a high dose, you're going to have a terrible experience unless you've already dealt with that stuff. Some people's psyches, I have a story. I had a friend, he's a medical doctor. He is a medical doctor now. This was back when I was very much into psychedelics. He wanted to have an LSD experience. He came over one night. I gave him half as much as I took. And we go downstairs and we start listening to, I think it was Alan Watts or something. And within just a few minutes, he's like grasping the side of the chair. His eyes are wide open. And I'm asking him how he's doing. Like, dude, you're all right? What's going on? And it's like he's seeing through me. He gets up, he's walking around. I'm talking to him. It's like he can't hear me. All of a sudden he gets up, he's walking like a zombie, pushes the flat screen TV over. I have to go grab it before he breaks it. I'm like, what is going on? I open the back door. He walks outside. I'm scratching my head like, what is going on? And I open the door. He's covered in dirt. He went and was like rolling around in the yard. And he went into an altered state where he was literally in a different place. I had done 3-4 times the amount that he had done. I had done it multiple times. I have never gone into a place where I did not know I was tripping. He did not know. He was in an altered place, and 5 hours go by. Eventually, I put a sweatshirt on him, and it was like watching a hypnotist. It was like as soon as the sweatshirt came back over his face, he was back. He said, "Hey, Pat, what's going on?" Like, man, I'm cold. What, I got all these bruises. He was like walking into the side of the brick house. Like he was not present in the world. He was present within a psychological hallucination. And that never happened to me. And so who you are, this stuff affects everybody very differently. And for it just to be out in the open for people to take, I think a lot of people will damage their psyche irreparably.
What about in my case?
They won't be able to repair it.
Right. So what about in my case where I actually grew up with a mother who was a Samoan, who pretty consistently beat me, and my father was a black man. So should I take these in a MAPS way or not?
I would be careful. I would be careful. A lot of the people that I know that
By the way, that does not mean minor attractive person. That means multidisciplinary approach to psychedelic studies. This is a U.S. study group, according to the Pinchbeck chapter.
Yeah, and it's one of the larger ones. It's in the Bay Area. It's run by Rick Strassman, who wrote the famous book, the psychedelic DMT, the spiritual molecule. Or Rick Doblin, actually. So Rick Strassman's part of the board. Rick Doblin runs MAPS, but it's a big deal. Dennis McKenna, Terence McKenna's brother, he's on the board. And so if you're going to do any federal research with psychedelics, MAPS is probably going to fund your research to allow it to go through and all this stuff. But I think it just depends. Again, I don't advocate for any of this stuff anymore.
Okay.
So I don't tell anybody to take anything. As an Orthodox Christian, inebriation is problematic. So I don't recommend any of that stuff. But according to peer-reviewed studies, according to laboratory research, according to what they're getting from people who have PTSD from like Iraq, that MDMA experiences, which is a much a much more mild psychedelic than like psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca or DMT. That they've had great breakthroughs with people who have PTSD that take these substances, they go into an altered state, they're forced to relive or deal with or confront with what the trauma that they're trying to avoid. Right. And then after the session, they feel like they can move beyond it. And so I don't know. I mean, it might help some people. As an Orthodox Christian, I don't advocate anybody taking it, but I mean, I didn't have a whole lot of bad experiences. I got out of all that stuff very cerebrally. When people talk about how did you get into Orthodox Christianity? Dude, it's from reading theology. Most people don't do that. It's a very strange way to like totally change your paradigm and get into something. But dude, it was totally through reading and like learning about the theology that got me into Orthodox. That took me out of where I was and put me totally somewhere else, because it couldn't be what I believed to be true couldn't be true based on the things that I assumed to be true. Sorry, that was about a roundabout way.
That's great. This is we're almost at 500 live. This is great. So tell me, one of the things that as I said, I don't know a whole lot about the psychonauts and all their stuff per se, but I did do a lot of reading in terms of like CIA and that kind of stuff. Yeah. Now that was going on a lot in the 60s, 70s, and they had the committee that looked into it, blah blah blah. To what degree do you think the power structure, CIA, these kinds of groups are still involved, if they're involved in this stuff? I mean, I think they probably still are. I think they're probably tweaking this stuff. And I don't think there's ever been a official, we're done with that now. I mean, it would seem to me that there's a direct link between big pharma, the entities that are tweaking this stuff, who were there from the beginning with Sandoz and Hoffman and these characters, Albert Hoffman. And my assumption would be that they're still involved in these types of things. I don't know to what degree, but what do you think about that? Because I go back to Lily's book, his autobiography, and again, I mean, maybe I'm not sure I believe everything Lily says. I think a lot of this, because he's kind of accused of being a BSer at times too.
Right. Same with Timothy Leary. I mean, they were really good friends, and they believed like each other to be like geniuses.
But I tend to think that like when he talks about back in the 40s and 50s that they were working on the brain chips.
Yeah.
I feel like that's probably true. I mean,
I do too.
Okay.
I feel like it's absolutely the CIA, the FBI, all the different intelligence agencies, they absolutely are pushing the psychedelic culture. Because even if we take the set and setting stuff seriously, which I do, because it definitely alters and affects one in an inebriated, altered state of consciousness. Right. But think then about the inversion of society itself from the 1960s think about set and setting, and think about then everybody who's dropping acid, taking mushrooms, and still engages with the culture during that state. They're being programmed into the CIA, the FBI, the globalist worldview. You know, if they're watching Beyonce, if they're watching YouTube videos, if they're watching anything in culture, they're already being initiated, right? They're already in that altered state where they're so suggestible.
Yeah.
That it's moving them towards everything the CIA and the FBI is working for, you know, globalism.
So in the introductory chapter,
Terence McKenna says that the initiation that's going on globally is going to make everybody into a citizen of the New World Order.
that's what he says in the first chapter, is that the initiation is all a plan, and it's to initiate everybody into that's his words.
Right.
The New World Order. That's not me.
Right.
Terence McKenna is not a conspiracy theorist. He says that when we initiate everybody, when we shamanize everybody, he says that we'll get them to commit to zero population growth. It just happens to be the very thing that Klaus...
Exactly. And he claims he got it from the mushroom.
Yeah,
which
the
I don't
told him that the Orange County white women need to stop having babies.
Yeah, exactly, because of the effect on the planet and everything.
Yes. You're tooting and making garbage.
And you know exactly, you can't help but notice, you know, again, there's debates. I don't know if CIA was working with Terence McKenna. If you read some of the really wild stories, like in True Hallucinations, he talks, that was when him and his brother went down and really had their sort of wild mushroom.
Oh, dude. Somebody just asked me to go on a stream with his brother.
With Dennis McKenna?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I was like, why would that dude want to talk to me? Like, I can't imagine. Yeah. Like, maybe he just wants to hear his brother speaking through me. Like, I could pretend. Like, I'm gonna contact in a seance Terence McKenna. Terence, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'd like to tell my brother that he needs to tie his fucking shoes. I'm waking up every day and I notice he doesn't tie his shoes.
And then I'll come back and I'll be like, did Terence speak to you? What did he say? And be like, oh, he told me to tie my shoes. Sorry, dude. I know you wanted something profound from the other end, from the beyond the netherworld, but that's all Terence had for you today.
You have to get a hold of Jonathan Edwards. Wasn't his show?
Channeling Terence McKenna. All right, I'm sorry that was really dumb, but yeah.
That's funny that you were asked to be on a show with, because you guys, your paradigms are entirely in opposition.
Maybe it would have made for an interesting conversation. By the way, when I was at the Mercado Sagrado event that I spoke at last year out in the Paramount Ranch, my booth was set up next to Terence's widow, and I the whole time I had no idea that was her. I was just sitting next to this older woman the whole time. And then afterwards, the people that organized the event, they were like, did you talk to Terence's widow? And I'm like, who? What are you talking about? She was like, I put you next to Terence's widow the whole day. I had no idea that was her.
It starts with a K.
Yeah, I don't remember her name.
Her last name's Harrison.
I said hi, but I had no idea who she was.
Cat. Yeah. Her name's like Catherine Harrison, or Cat. People call her Cat. But I think the CIA is certainly involved. There's a whole theory that, you know, even within this book, Terence talks about running into a former Nazi, and I think he's somewhere in Southeast Asia trying to collect butterflies, and he is selling cannabis and hashish and stuff like that. And so he talks about how he gets picked up by Interpol. And he had to talk with the government when he came back to the United States. And that is right before then he goes down to Peru on
you gotta watch out for that Nazi weed, man. Are you serious?
Oh, dude, it's wild stories. Yeah. So this is like him trying to document his life, because he drops out of Berkeley, California, because he's in, like, they had like these weird programs for like gifted students in the early 60s. They were like experimental majors. And so he was one of those students that like gets introduced to all the, you know, gets all the best classes from all the best professors at Berkeley. And it's like this generalistic undergraduate degree. And And eventually in like his junior year, he drops out because he's in Berkeley if he stayed there, it'd be between 64 and 68, 69. So he gets there in like 64, 65. And right at a height, the counterculture is really getting going. He's in the Bay Area there. And then he drops out and he actually goes to Tibet because after he had done DMT multiple times, he believed the DMT flash was most represented in the aesthetics of Tibetan Buddhism. And so he goes to Tibet and he tries to see if they have a secret psychedelic tradition. He goes there, he finds out, no, actually, psychedelics aren't very popular within Buddhism per se, but the Bon tradition within Tibet that Tibetan Buddhism synthesized with actually did ingest intoxicants. And so he gets very much interested in that. And then he just travels Southeast Asia for a couple of years as a butterfly collector. Yeah. And it's why he's collecting butterflies and traveling and selling weed to make more money that he gets picked up by.
That sounds like a cover. That sounds like an intelligence cover. Yeah.
That could be. I'm just saying what he writes down in his book and claims is his story. So it gets pretty interesting. Eventually he meets a former Nazi individual that wants him to kind of work for him and finds out about what he's doing or this or that. But people think that Terence McKenna was working for the CIA. His brother claims that is absolutely ridiculous and that would never been the case. But that's a contentious topic. And you know who Jan Irving is? He's the one that's really popularized this idea that Terence McKenna worked for the CIA. But you have to be careful with that guy's work.
I was looking for that quote. I thought it was in this weirdo Millennium obscure book that has essays from all these futurists in it. And I was looking for the section where he says, Lucifer. Oh, no, it's at the beginning of the John C. Lilly book. I just wanted to point out that he says, Crowley, excuse me. He says, if you want to understand the future and where we're going, he says there's... He's trying to pick out the Isaac Newtons of our day, and he says Crowley is the one of the Newtons of our day. Who does he say? Ridiculous. He says here's the figures of the exploration, the new frontier, which he means not exterior but the new frontier of the psyche, right? He says Crowley, Gurdjieff, Tom Robbins, Huxley, Christopher Hewitt, I don't know who that is, Alan Watts, and Ram Dass. He says Crowley is the guy to look to, and he mentions Cary Grant, by the way, doing LSD, which I put in my book. A lot of people don't know that Cary Grant was tripping balls before any of the hippies were.
I believe it. I mean, the Beat Generation, they were already, Allen Ginsberg and Burroughs had already gone down to Peru. He already did the ayahuasca before people knew that ayahuasca existed. William Burroughs already did it, and then so we see the homosexuality, we see all this different stuff already present, in the Beat Generation that was already interested in psychedelics.
A couple of interesting points that I covered, by the way, in my talk on the Lilly book and the Millennium book. So, and by the way, the Millennium book has Salk, Leary, Barbara Marx Hubbard, Marilyn Ferguson, many names that you would probably recognize from kind of being the so-called counterculture, right, left cutting edge people. Just to give you a cursory analysis of what Leary says in this essay back from, this was written in 1981. This book is 81. Leary says the future is artificial intelligence. The future is transhumanism, computer brain interfaces. And he says the scientist is the hero of the future. So he's basically telling you that they're going to make, quote, scientists the new archetype of the hero. Yep. Right. And this includes the retard pop scientists like, Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye and these goobers. Yeah. But he says that they will preach a message of social justice. He says that they will be a kind of new monastic class. They will be treated like a religious priest class. And he says that we will have a liberation from all of the previous ideas of what man and society is. He says it is the age of transition, which is a buzzword that you want to be familiar with. He says in the future, what we'll be concerned with is IQ levels, and IQ will give us the scientific priest class. He says, and then through genetic modification, through cloning, and the New Age movement. I'm not kidding. This is what he says in this chapter. He says through genetic modification of food and humans, through cloning and the New Age religion, we'll have a transhumanist society that will transcend all that has been known before. And he says, how do we know that that's where we're going? He says, because everything's in evolutionary flux, dude, and we all know that. That's what he says. We all know that. We all know that everything's in evolutionary flux, so it has to be going to this. What else is there?
And that's what I wanted to highlight is within the sort of psychedelic stuff. I would say psychedelic spirituality moves in its sort of institutional form more towards the Leary side than the Alan Watts side, meaning that it is about science, that it is about, so the worldview, the reason why the scientists fit so nicely into it is that they're already believing man is God and man is the one of ultimate authority and everything is a social construction. And so then these psychedelics are so radical and so profound that now we realize this, we see the advancement of technology. And so the scientist represents who the real priest is. That is the priest in their worldview. That is the magician, right? They are the wizard. And so when we see the Robert Anton Wilson's or move into, the Neil deGrasse Tyson's or something like that, it's such a scientific paradigm of man's rational capabilities, figuring out how the world really is, and we're going to move forward. We're going to be spacefaring. We're going to travel, Star Wars.
Well, there's actually an essay in this where the girl, I don't know who she is. She's no name person, but the futurist girl who writes on human sexuality in the future says you're going to get to have space coitus, by which she means you'll be floating. You'll get to have floating coitus. Well,
I mean, Terence McKenna has a famous lecture called Alien Love. And it's talking about sort of the erotic nature of high dose psychedelics, and then his understanding of like potential higher forms of beings and sex with aliens. And so he transcends all these different things. But that's what's so interesting about the confluence of the psychedelic spirituality is that it's at the same time, they're all going to talk about an archaic revival. So at the same time, they're talking about a scientific revolution, a technocratic one world government. They want an archaic revolution, but what is the archaic revival? It's really the morality, the epistemology, the sophistication of the plebs. And that is where we're going back to an archaic structure. It's not the aristocrats. The science, they still want to be spacefaring. Elon Musk still wants his 5G satellites wrapping around the planet. That's not going to change. What's going to change is you're going to live in a dirt hut. You're going to live in an archaic, shamanic, tribal form of living. And and by the way, we're actually going to reduce the population.
In palaces and spaceships, you're going to be living in a hut at Burning Man, sharing your comb with a dude with stinky-ass dreads.
Yeah. And so like Terence McKenna talked about how he's always about this archaic revival, believes that archaic forms of ecstasy are returning, and this is really the absent part of the sort of rational man of the 20th century. And then at the same time, he says his biggest dream, if he could be anywhere, would be in a spaceship, exploring the universe with all his books, like Moby Dick, who's the Captain Ahab and Moby Dick, he's going out there and exploring the universe. So it's like, well, how can you hold both those? How can you hold that somehow the psychedelics bring about a return to nature and a return to archaic structures of ecstasy and society, and then also believe in a one world technocratic government where we're going to be spacefaring and all this? It doesn't matter. Again, there's a fundamental contradiction.
Dude, you're going to have space coitus. Who cares? Just look forward to that. Geez, can't you be... I mean, does nothing make you happy? You can't... All right. I'm sorry. We're gonna have to close up right now.
Yeah, and there's one more thing I wanted to mention here, and it's something that most people aren't going to be aware of. But there's a book. I don't necessarily advocate for the thesis of this book, but there's a very interesting book called Secret Drugs of Buddhism. It's by a guy named Mike Crowley. And it's a more recent book, and it has a foreword written by Anne Shulgin. So those of you who are more sophisticated in the psychedelic worldview, Sasha Shulgin developed all these different drugs, these different psychedelics. His wife wrote a foreword to this, but Mike Crowley, tying back really the whole conversation of today, believes that Vajrayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, does have a psychedelic tradition. Now, this, you're not going to find any Tibetan Buddhists actually say this. This is his argument based on help from linguists and stuff like that. He claims to be a Tibetan Buddhist. I don't put much credence in any Western person who claims to be a Buddhist, but he feels that soma that we were talking about at the beginning of this talk, back to the Vedic traditions of India, and this god named Soma, who was an intoxicant brew that the priest would drink. He believes that gets moved into Tibetan tantric forms of Buddhism. So Buddhism itself arrives in Tibet last, as the last place that it arrives in. So it's not till the 8th century that Tibetan Buddhism comes into existence. It is at that point that Shiva, a very popular deity in Hinduism, reemerges infused as a god within Tibetan Buddhism. And the name used in Tibetan Buddhism is Avalokitesvara. So if you want me to spell that, it's Avalokitesvara. And he talks about how the translation of Vajrayana, so Theravada, the lesser vehicle, Mahayana, the greater vehicle, Vajrayana means the thunderbolt vehicle. And this is going to tie back to R. Gordon Wasson here in a second. But Mike Crowley claims that there's a special unique rite within Vajrayana Buddhism, and it's called the Amarita. It's a sort of sacramental ritual, and it almost looks like a teapot. He claims that was used for the ingestion of urine, because if you get into the use of Amanita muscaria, the famous red and white mushroom, Toad on Mario Kart, all this different stuff, this mushroom can be toxic. You have to dry it out so you don't ingest what's called muscimol, which is going to make you very, very sick, and it can kill you if you have enough in your system. So it's very common, even within Siberian shamanism, where this mushroom is very prominent, that reindeers will eat the Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and the local Inuit will drink the urine of the deer or the reindeer because it's already passed through and it doesn't have all the toxins. It still is just as intoxicating 2 or 3 times through. And so it's interesting that Mike Crowley claims that this interesting teapot, which is unique to Vajrayana Buddhism, he claims is used for a very special urine ingesting ritual that he claims is tied to the secret tradition of Soma going back to ancient India.
Bruh. Now I know why David Bowie is transformed into the teapot in season 3 of Twin Peaks. Thank you. You just made that connection. I could why is he a teapot? A teapot? What? I bet you money that is what. I mean, does it literally look like a teapot?
Yeah. It looks like a very elaborate sort of teapot that you would pour out. And so that whole urine drinking, for those of you who don't know, within the psychedelic community, it's very popular to talk about, don't you know the origins of Christmas? And talking about how Santa Claus is a sort of Siberian shamanic figure, that the North Pole is really the sort of Yggdrasil, the world axis, the world tree at the North Pole. And this is the Axis Mundi. And that the reindeer, the reason why he has flying reindeer is because reindeer are one of the few species known to ingest this intoxicant, this Amanita muscaria mushroom. So reindeer actually like to get high and trip off this mushroom. So we have Santa Claus, this who himself, again, this debated, did Coca-Cola change the colors of Christmas to red and white? Did it exist before? You can look at old Germanic Christmas cards. They're red and white. But the presence of the red and white color motif within Christmas is tied, some people believe, to the red and white mushroom. So the whole Christmas tree, what do we usually use? We use pine trees or birch trees. Pine trees or birch trees are the trees in which these mushrooms grow under. So we see that so these particular trees in Siberia, that's where these mushrooms would grow under. Say the shaman would then go pick these mushrooms and he would lay them on the branches of the tree. So that'd be the sort of decorating of the Christmas tree. And then he would dry them out. That's why he's plucking them from the ground and putting them out for the sun to dry on the tree. Then he dries them, then he can ingest them. So we see in the myth of Santa Claus, the sort of pagan Santa Claus, we see somebody who flies around with his reindeer and creates toys built by elves. Well, what do people talk about when they go into high dose DMT mushroom states? They talk about seeing elves. They talk about seeing like Terence McKenna, self-transforming machine elves, goblins, gnomes, all this different stuff. Miniaturized humanoid figures. We see the same thing within Santa Claus, that those people work for him and that somehow they can make toys for him to give to other people. So it's very interesting, some of the motifs related potentially to this particular mushroom that's used in Siberian shamanism.
Yeah.
But it's also who this guy, he's arguing, is part of Vajrayana, Tibetan, tantric forms of Buddhism.
I've always wondered what that connection is between Father Mushroom and Christmas and this mythology. Not Orthodox Christmas, but the whatever the maybe the Nordic. I mean, there is a Nordic mythology of. Have you heard of this? Of like Father Mushroom and this kind of stuff.
Yep.
And he does have that similarity to like a Santa Claus kind of figure. But have you watched Twin Peaks at all?
I have not. I honestly do not watch much of anything.
Yeah,
I watch
I don't blame
YouTube.
you.
I watch your stuff, but I'm not a movie person.
Okay.
I know that's more of a television series.
Right.
I have friends
there's
that
a
watch it.
movie, and yeah, there's three seasons of a show and one movie. But I just was asking because the Lynch populates the series with so many Tibetan Buddhist and Far Eastern concepts, symbols, mythology. It's an interesting collage of these things that pop up, and if people are into Lynch, then it's kind of this ongoing thing where you kind of decode new things. And so I could never understand why the David Bowie character, who's an FBI agent in season 2, and then he sort of appears in, well, he's referenced in season 2, but he appears in the movie. And then he kind of disappears, and then there's this weird scene in season 3 where Cooper, the protagonist guy, is kind of seeking him out, and he goes into this alternate dimension, and we find that the David Bowie character is a giant teapot who speaks. Literally, I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but this is in the in-between realm where the manifestation of things can kind of be anything.
Wow.
So
I guarantee you that David Lynch has read this book.
There you go. Yeah.
Because this is a very unique book, because he's one of the few authors to make this claim that there is a secret psychedelic mushroom tradition within Tibetan tantric forms of Buddhism.
That makes
sense.
sense.
And this is very unique. And he uses a lot of different ways to make his claim. He uses, rituals, historical evidence, linguistic evidence. But I've never seen any other scholar claim that. That's why, I'm not going to support his thesis, but it's interesting to read, at least to know that it's out there. But it sounds like based on, because David Lynch is all about consciousness, transcendental meditation, Buddhism, all that stuff. There's no way that if him being in all that stuff, probably, oh, wow, there's a new book that's actually supported by higher names in the psychedelic community of this guy who's done research on a psychedelic mushroom in Tibetan Buddhism.
I think you're right. All right, let's get to the super chats, and forgive my gesticulations and my spurging. I'm sorry, David, if that is annoying.
No, dude, no, I didn't even notice.
It's just part. You're just used to my particular instantiation of the TARD. So I have my own little TARD that I instantiate. Quillis for $3. Do you have a list of the books the elite that you've covered? I mean, there is at my website, there's a recommended reading list. It hasn't been updated in a while because I've been trying to figure out how to get that list organized, which is very difficult given the website. But all of those books are there. I mean, there's almost 50 now. I'm not going to list them out, but just go to the website, and there's most of the books listed there. Thank you for that $3, Quillis. What you talking about, Willis? What you talking about, Quillis? Pano Costoros, $3. Jay, you killed it alongside Nick, Hallex, and the other day, Kotel, he's saying to you, Kotel, we got to hang out. Pano says we got to hang out.
Oh, he's a he's a good guy. He lives in Indiana. That's why he's saying that. He lives up at Purdue in Lafayette, near Purdue.
Where to go? Logos Unveiled. Thank you for that, Pano. Logos Unveiled for $4 says, why are psychedelics looked down upon when many people have had experiences that led them down the path to find orthodoxy? Well, exactly. That's what we actually covered that question earlier. I knew a question like that was going to come up. He says, 2 years ago, I had an experience that led me ultimately to Christ, and I've come across countless others who've had similar experiences. I think that the point here is that the ends don't justify the means. That's
right.
what I would say.
Right.
Do you have any?
I totally agree. And I don't know, again, like talking about providence, I think is tricky because sometimes we sort of justify wrongdoings as sort of providential, yearnings of God himself. I don't know. I just know that I got deep into the psychedelic stuff, and I got also out of it and into orthodoxy. And I do feel to a degree it's providential because it gave me the vocabulary and a background to then talk to all those men that are in that same position right now, because I've already done all those drugs. So one of the things, because of that ego inflation of the psychedelics, it's like if you're into DMT, ayahuasca, LSD, you're not going to give a shit about what somebody else says who hasn't done those things. It's like listening to a virgin talk to you about sex. It's like, why would you care?
Yeah, so, but what about a space virgin and space coitus? Would you listen to him then or not? Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, you could make a similar argument by like saying, dude, I mean, like, why not have 50 wives? Because like, if one of them's Orthodox, she could lead you to Orthodoxy. Like my 50th wife led me to Orthodoxy, so we should have 50 wives.
Right.
Big baller for $3. Thank you for the Global Elite book series. It is much appreciated. Thank you. And be sure to, if you don't know, if you're watching this, I do an analysis of the 50, so far we're about 50. We're not stopping. We're going to keep going as long as we can. Writings of the elite of the last century. And I do your homework for you. So you pay me and I'll do your homework. All right. Hence the nerd thing. But thank you, Big Balla. McCurry, M. Curry says for $5. Thank you, David and Jay. I appreciate your work. Could you, either of you, speak to the biblical use of these substances to treat illnesses such as depression or PTSD? God bless. That's kind of what we hit on earlier too. I wasn't trying to get ahead of your question. I didn't see your question, but I knew it was going to come up. And we kind of didn't have a definite silver bullet in every case situation. There could be, uses for these things in certain cases, but I agree with David that it's not helpful to society to have like all of this legalized, right?
Yeah. There's too many people. We already have an epidemic of mental crisis and mental health. To then exacerbate that with people literally going out of their mind, I don't think it's good. Luckily, I have a big ego, and so maybe that's why I never had a lot of bad problems with the psychedelics. Is I don't have a fragile psyche that can be shattered and, I can't put it and piece itself back together. I don't think people who do the YouTube stuff, to do this, you have to have an ego. You have to think that I know something and I feel like I can share it with other people. That is a sort of egoic drive. But so many people are already having mental problems. We have depression. We have all this stuff. I think there's a lot of better means to deal with that. Mostly, like, go work out. If you're not working out and you're not eating healthy, psychedelics shouldn't be an option to solve your mental problems or your depression. That's not going to
you can't solve a spiritual problem with some food or chemical. I mean, it requires, spiritual healing. That's ultimately what humanity's problem is. It's not a biological chemical, imbalance or whatever. It's a spiritual problem. And then the other problems flow from that.
Right.
That's my take on it. Which is not to say that you shouldn't get your diet right and follow the kind of regimen like David covers in a lot of his videos. You should, but I mean, the spiritual, you put it in a hierarchy, right? The spiritual first, and then those others after that.
Yep.
Vampire Frog for $5 says, Jay, are you ever going to do a talk on AA? I don't know. I've never been to AA. I don't know much about AA. Yes, I have heard of the New Age and quasi-cultic background to AA, but I don't know enough about it really to comment on it. Vampire Frog goes on to say they have Young and Crowley behind them. I didn't know that. And a cult with the same name with a low recovery rate. Are you saying Argentium Astrum? I don't think Argentium Astrum is the same as AA. That would be pretty weird if you're a drunkard and you go to AA and you show up and there's like Crowley's there trying to do butt things. Or that would be pretty weird. But I'm confused. I don't know. But I think you're talking about the Argentium Astrum, but I don't think that's connected to AA. Simeon M for $10. I'm currently a Pentecostal. I'm currently a Pentecostal. Considering orthodoxy, would you draw any comparison between the increase in charismatic Christian spirituality and the increase in the West, in the forms of spirituality that you mentioned tonight? Yes, and I will once again mention Crowley. Guess what Crowley said was one of the closest forms of Christianity to Crowleyanism, according to Crowley, charismatic Pentecostalism. Mm-hmm. And he said that because he thought that the direct possession and inspiration idea, like in voodoo, was much closer to what the magus is really trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you can have all these robes and magic circles or whatever, but the point of all that is to get you to this possessed state. And so he thought that, and so in that sense, because the New Age is actually the father of the New Age, as Tim Leary says, is really Crowley. Right.
I think that is true. Yeah. And so even from a psychedelic paradigm, drug use, sexual promiscuity, monism, man is God, all that stuff's thelemic.
Exactly. Right. So thank you for that, Simeon M. $10. And if you're coming from a Pentecostal background, I would definitely say look into Orthodoxy, and particularly the doctrine of the Trinity, because the Pentecostal charismatic sects.
Can I say one thing? When you're mentioning that Thelema was, or Crowley said Pentecostalism was closest to his Thelema, I would say also a very strong resonance with Pentecostalism is Gestalt therapy. That is very popular at Esalen. Have you ever heard of that? Gestalt?
I know what Gestalt therapy is, but how does that connect to charismaticism?
Because it's about getting people into these ecstatic, altered states to heal them, do all this stuff. So you get women. So if you look at Esalen, I have Jeffrey Kreipel's big book on Esalen, but he has a whole section on Gestalt, and you see some of the photos. I mean, these women look like they're possessed. They almost look like Neo from the Matrix, where he's avoiding the bullets, he's bent backwards, and a man has his hands over their body. They're in positions that you couldn't imagine.
I didn't know that. So I've read some in philosophy classes that dealt with Gestalt images, which were the pictures that look like two different things. And so they would try to do psychological analysis from how people would interpret the Gestalt images. But I didn't know that it dealt with are you thinking of the Brownsville revival type thing where people are rolling around barking like dogs and stuff like that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, actually, just getting into these really wacky, altered states. That Gestalt therapy, which is big at Esalen, they were doing that back in the 60s of trying to get people into these altered states without using drugs. How can they do it without the drugs? And so they would use these methods of sort of mixture of hypnosis and energetic possession.
So is this Werner Erhard and Est type stuff?
Yeah.
Do you know about that? Mm-hmm. Didn't he have something about grunt and No, I'm serious. Where you were supposed to grunt yourself into this altered state. I'm serious.
Right. I mean, yeah. Okay. Yeah. The Gestalt therapy is a little bit different, but it has a lot of similarities.
Okay. Thank you. Will for $10, and yes, he had that many L's. He says, "Great chat, guys. I was young shroomer, but now I'm young boomer." No, I'm joking. He says, "I was young shroomer, but now I'm young Orthodox. Glory to God." That's what we want to hear. That's good. Thank you for that, Will, and really, really glad to hear that you are in the Orthodox Church. Womp,
Yeah,
womp.
Fritz Perls. Sorry, you know Fritz Perls. Okay, he's he was, and then who created the orgone machine? The German dude.
Wilhelm Reich.
Yes, Wilhelm Reich also was an inspiration for Gestalt therapy.
Yeah, well, he was a quack.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Womp womp, $5. This is a bit off topic, but I want your take on this, both of you. I've read Heidegger, and while there are lots of sophistry there, he seems to be grasping at an essence energy distinction and being distinction. Any thoughts? So Heidegger does have familiarity with some of these older ideas of problems in Greek philosophy. So because he does know about Plato and he knows about the Hellenic disputes and the questions of logos and being, he was probably touching on similar questions. I don't think he knew much about Orthodox theology and the Orthodox conception of the essence energy distinction, although that does have similarities to Aristotle. If you've read Bradshaw's Aristotle East and West, but that would be, my guess would be just the happenstance familiarity that Heidegger has with Greek philosophy, and not anything to do necessarily with the Orthodox Church Fathers. But I could be wrong. I know he read St. Paul, and he did try to have interpretations of Paul. I don't think they were Orthodox, but that would be my guess. But I've only read a few things from Heidegger. I'm not a super Heideggerian scholar, so there's not a whole lot I could add to that.
I would mention that I have Being in Time, and I'm using it for one of my papers that I'm writing for my school stuff in regards to trying to frame the academic, sort of intellectual movements that were happening in the 1960s. And so when we look at like postmodernism and the movements of Jacques Derrida, greatly influenced by the phenomenology of Heidegger. And so Heidegger's being, even though he may use terms that are reminiscent for us, like logos and theology, he was trying to do things without a metaphysics, because he is, again, operating on an atheistic framework. Right. So he's trying to borrow these things like logos, like order, like being as being, but without metaphysics.
Exactly.
And so
without revelation, ultimately, which is, that's the key thing here, is that you can't, like Father Deacon's always saying, you can't build a metaphysical system. Orthodox Christianity is not a metaphysical project where we're trying to construct a reality. We're actually studying revealed theology, which gives us insight into the metaphysics. By the way, I would add, everybody, we had a little bit of scheduling conflict. That was all my fault. And after this, when we're done here in a minute, I want to remind everybody to go over to Father Deacon's channel. He is doing his catechesis tonight. Him and his deacon at his church are doing catechesis. And so I didn't want to take away from the audience there. But if you're new to Orthodoxy, or if you're looking at Orthodoxy, be sure and go over there and check out and subscribe to Father Deacon. The link is in the chat, and tune into their catechesis as we wrap this up. Father Deacon John says for 383, during his book tour for Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry, Jeffrey Lieberman says he tried LSD when he was at university. This led him to believe the psychotropic drugs could treat so-called mental illness. Yeah, we kind of dealt with that question earlier about, that this has been pushed as a form of treatment, and then we kind of hesitated to say whether there could be some use for that. But I think David and I agree that it really doesn't make sense to have this stuff legalized on a mass scale. I mean, the other thing too is people, but like the libertarians always say, but dude, like you used to be able to, like you could go down to the freaking drugstore, dude, and you could buy Coke, man. Like how sweet would it be if you could just walk down to the drugstore and buy Coke? Well, that was in a much less degenerate society. Yes. When everybody's totally degenerate, dude, drive to Boulder. And see all the homeless people just laid out everywhere. That's what you're going to get, is a degenerate, just the masses of Skid Row when you make every drug legal.
And some with fractured psyches that will never repair because they should have never taken the stuff in the first place.
Exactly. I mean, hey, I'm a Spurg boy. I can make these jokes, and maybe I'm messed up from when I did my trip experience. So there you go. I'm having fun here. Andreas, $4. I'm dealing with severe anxiety, and my flatmates have convinced me to take the shroom. What am I supposed to do? Number one, if you are dealing with anxiety, why are you going to take a drug that's going to make you possibly freak out, dude? That's not the solution here. I'm already skeptical of my flatmates' worldview, but they think it will make me into a happy hippie, more of a hippie. Dude.
Why would that be?
Don't do that. That's my advice.
Yeah, my advice, obviously I'm not advocating anybody to take these substances, but definitely don't take them if you're in a bad psychological place. That is asking for a bad trip. And you're always going to remember that stuff. So just be careful with it. Like, this isn't a joke.
Yeah, and I will say, do not. This is not a stream to advocate drug use, so that is against, of course, YouTube policies. I do not advocate for the illegal use of drugs at all. And I would say these are very dangerous things, and stay away. And I think you open yourself up to demonic forces potentially, and delusion. That's the main thing here, is that a lot of these things promote pre-list. And you don't get the enlightenment that you think you're getting. You just get deluded, and ultimately it's demonic. So now, I'm not saying that all substances are inherently wrong. I drink coffee, right? I don't drink alcohol anymore. Gave up alcohol a long time ago, but I don't smoke cigarettes anymore. Gave up all that. So it's just not really worth it. Substances don't do much. I mean, when you're 20, you think it's going to be this amazing thing, and then by the time you're 30, you're not going out and partying anymore. It's not as fun, and it's like, this is not healthy. So no.
I feel like the older you get, the more you appreciate mornings. It's like you want to feel good and be able to hop up and like do something.
And you the more you appreciate sobriety and level-headedness. That's how I feel. But all right, be sure and follow our friend David Patrick over his channel, and be sure and hop on over to. Yes, Alex did want me to drink a bottle of whiskey. I told him I would definitely hang out, and we hung out, but I didn't drink a bottle of whiskey. I can't handle a bottle of whiskey, so that would basically destroy me. My guts don't process alcohol anymore. I had enough alcohol in my 20s, so not condemning anybody that drinks. I don't think drinking is inherently wrong, obviously, but.
Well, you did a great job down there in Atlanta, man. Looked like
thanks,
you guys
dude.
had a lot of fun.
It was wild. I didn't experience or expect any of that. Yes, I know the Eucharist has. The Eucharist is the exception. But again, hop on over to David's channel. Hop on over to Father Deacon Dr. Ananias. We don't want to keep his stream distracted anymore. So be sure immediately go over to Norwegian Noose's channel. David, thank you so much.
Thank you, brother, for having me.
Yeah, let's get into more of this in the near future if you want to. This is your
for sure.
area.
Yeah, dude, you tell me a book.
Awesome, dude.